In this lesson, we're going to discuss tactics for using hoppers, large stimulators, and droppers. I like to group these together as you're going to be utilizing more than one of the Drifthook Fly Fishing kits to accomplish catching large trout on the surface and subsurface. These techniques will cover both the surface layer and emerging and free-floating nymph patterns. We also go into different dropper techniques that you can use when prepping your fly rigs for specific water and seasonal scenarios. First, let's dive into hoppers. Newcomers typically struggle with hoppers. To successfully catch trout using this fishing method, you must mimic the action of a grasshopper and fish when the conditions are just right. This is typically during late summer and into early fall. So how do we fly fish with hoppers? Before we begin discussing the best way to catch fish using hoppers, we first need to understand what hoppers are. Now, some people already know, but if you're a newcomer to fishing and you've never been around someone using this method before, you might be a little confused. So what are hoppers? Essentially, they're small man-made variations of a grasshopper. Yep, that's it. Pretty simple. So trout love to eat grasshoppers when they're available, which is usually around late summer. How to set it up. For the basic hopper dropper rig setup, we're going to attach a 9-foot leader with approximately an extra 12 to 24 inches of 5X or 6X tippet. Have the leader the same size as your fly rod. Yes, if you have a 10-foot rod, get a 10-foot leader. If you have a 9-foot rod, get a 9-foot leader. Attach the first fly to the end of the leader using the improved clinch knot. Now we're going to add an extra 12 to 24 inches of 5X or 6X tippet with improved clinch knot, and then we're going to add our second smaller fly with a final non-slip loop knot. I typically like to fly fish with the nylon leader because the nylon is going to float on the surface. And then all my droppers, I typically use a fluorocarbon because that's going to sink below that surface and be a little bit more invisible to the fish as it's floating along. Now after you have your hopper tied on and your additional tippet, we're going to want to add on a bead-headed nymph pattern. Now reference your seasonal hatch chart to find the corresponding bead-head fly in your arsenal that matches the chart. The reason we're looking for a bead-headed pattern here is that we're going to need that extra weight to sink the pattern below the surface so we can fish 2 levels of the water column. You can also drop off the back end any additional dry fly patterns that are in season. This would be almost a 2 dry type of setup versus a dry dropper. So why do hoppers work anyways? It all comes to what the trout think they're getting when they rise to the surface. They're not just going for a swim to see what's going on in the neighborhood. Oh no, they're on the prowl for food. And when you're a trout looking for a hearty meal, seeing a grasshopper blown off a bush in your direction is a substantial meal. The trout drawn to this free meal come up to take a bite, but only end up with your hook in their mouth. If you're going to mimic hoppers, you'll need to be smart about it. Hoppers are found on the edges of rivers during late summer and into the fall. Before then, you're unlikely to have much success. They work exceptionally well during August when trout are increasingly hungry and in search of food. Most climates can be teeming with life during spring, but once summer begins, things start to die down a little bit, especially in the hotter areas. Size. Hoppers come in a range of sizes. As with designs, you'll need a variety of options in your kit. Some work on certain days and certain conditions better than others. For example, smaller sizes may not work as well as larger ones when conditions are a little obscured, since they can be challenging to see. However, one thing about the size is that it's highly subjective. Some people swear by size 12, while others prefer the agile nature of size 16. Depending on your location, this may vary. What I always like to do is as I'm walking down to the river and I see a grasshopper, I try to grab it and I check out the size. Then I try to match my pattern towards the size of what is actually there at the river. So what are the right conditions for hopper fly fishing? There's a knack to finding success with hoppers that you'll quickly appreciate. You'll want the right hoppers to be out there at the right times. So to begin with, this means the right times of year. Late summer into the fall is probably going to be your most attractive time for grasshoppers. Now you can go ahead and try them in January if you like, but the fish are unlikely to be fooled. The biggest nemesis to a fly fisher is wind. But when you're using hoppers, this can be extremely beneficial. Not only is it easier to cast a large hopper in the wind, but hoppers are getting pushed off of the grasses and bushes because of this wind, and if you're in the right place in the right time where this wind is happening and hoppers are active, it can be an amazing time to be fly fishing. Trout are highly alert to the movement of grasshoppers above their heads, so you'll find a huge success when the winds are high. One highly underrated trick is just to follow the lead of the actual grasshoppers. So if you're in an area where that seems there to be a lot of movement, then stay right there. After all, you're attempting to make the fish believe that you're offering a genuine grasshopper. Now what better way of doing that than blending in with the real thing? Having said that, the absence of grasshoppers in the area doesn't necessarily mean that you won't succeed. Fly fishermen have reported great success with hoppers during summers when grasshoppers weren't even around. So when's not the right time? Now there are some periods when it's best to leave the hopper equipment at home and use different methods. even during hopper season. For the hopper method to be effective, you're going to want conditions to be a little chaotic. For example, you'll have more success when the wind is blowing and the water's a little bit choppy. If there's no wind and the air is entirely still, you're going to have a tougher time catching something off a hopper. Generally speaking anyways. There are many instances where calm still conditions can still be excellent. For example, if there have been several days of perfect hopper conditions, the fish are more likely going to be on the lookout for these grasshoppers. Even if the real thing won't make it their way actually into the water, the trout will be in tune to the previous eating habit. Choosing the right environment. As well as the weather, you're also going to need to look at the general environment that you're trying to fish. There are some scenarios and locations that are just not conducive to hopper fishing. It should go without saying that the water source should be a place where grasshoppers actually live. You should focus your energy on areas where the water level isn't too high and isn't too quick. Trout don't like to rise to the surface in extremely fast water. This will be times of runoff, elevated levels of rain. In some areas, you won't need to overthink it. You'll be able to find the right hopper spot without much effort. If you can see a few grasshoppers on the bank without giving it much thought, it's worth casting your rod. As for most things that are related with hopper fly fishing, some things just need to be felt out. After a few times fishing in the same area, you're going to get a sense of which spots work great and which ones don't. When I'm casting, I'm always looking for tall grasses or brush that's overhanging the water, undercut banks where a hopper might fall off into the water. When I'm scoping out these areas, I keep in mind that this is going to be a great holding ground for also large trout. Now, one mistake that most beginners that are trying out hoppers is that they are casting too gently to the water, and this is completely opposite of everything you've ever learned from dry fly fishing. Grasshoppers have some weight on them. They're not going to gently land on the water like a tiny fly, especially since they're not voluntarily going into the water. The wind's blowing them that way, so they're not going to go landing like a gymnast. They're going to hit the water with some comparable force. So you should try to mimic that landing style with your rod. Don't be afraid to use a little more force to get that fly out there. Of course, don't go overboard. We're not trying to scare the fish away, but at the same time, don't be overly gentle. Let the fish know that the grasshopper's arrived. When you cast to the bank, try to get about 2-3 inches from hitting the bank. I know that sounds hard, but a little practice, I think you can do it. Now, if you land on the bank, don't worry. All you need to do is point your rod tip into the water and strip the fly off the bank with your retrieve hand. This will actually pull the pattern down off the bank. Now, if you try to lift your rod and pull the pattern up, this most likely is going to happen is you're going to pull it off too far and it's going to not land in the zone that you want to be. Now, if you've casted 3 feet over the bank, I recommend just to pull it all back in and restart your cast, because trying this technique's not going to work when you're that high off the bank. The great thing about hopper droppers is they work also great in the seams. If you have any further questions on where to find trout, check out our beginner series on how to read the water. This will show you the best places to hunt out monster trout. Hopper action. So there are a couple things you can do with the hopper while it's in the water to draw the fish's attention. One method is to vibrate the hopper. Now this is going to mimic the struggle of a real grasshopper would experience when he falls off a branch and lands into the water. Now an error would be to try to drag your hopper along the water or sometimes underneath it to make it look like the hopper's going for a nice little swim. Well, they're not going to be doing that when they hit the water. A simple back and forth vibration from your rod tip down the line to the fly will give enough a little bit of movement for that to have that initial shock value. After the initial vibration, you can let it dead drift like it would with a typical dry fly. Now, most of the times you're not going to need to do this because you'll find that when that grasshopper hits the water, you're going to instantly have a trout coming up for it if it's hungry. That's the fun thing about hoppers. To newcomers, it usually takes them by surprise. So be ready. Dry droppers. Now that we've discussed the hopper dropper technique, I'd like to go into detail on a few dry dropper techniques that you can add to your arsenal. In our previous session, dry fly perfection and emerger swing combos, we discussed fly setups for a 2-fly dry dropper. Have the leader the same size as your rod, and then attach the first fly to the end of the leader using the improved clinch knot. Add 12 to 24 inches of 5 or 6X tippet with another improved clinch knot, and then add your second smaller fly with your last improved clinch knot. As soon as you've mastered this technique, you can explore 2 additional dropper rig setups that add an additional fly and more movement to the fly in the water column. The first rig setup that we're going to discuss is the free sliding dropper. Now this setup's a little more challenging as you're going to be attaching 2 sets of tippets off the hook bend of your dry fly or hopper. Start by having a leader the same size as your rod, and at the end of the leader we're going to attach about 2 feet of tippet using the double surgeon knot. From there, we're going to tie on our first fly. It could be a hopper or it could be a stimulator or a dry fly using the improved clinch knot. From there, we're going to go 6 to 10 inches of additional tippet off that back hook. Now, you're probably thinking we're going to add on our second fly right now, but we're not. What we're going to do is we're going to actually tie a double surgeon's knot to another 6 to 10 inches worth of tippet. From there, we're going to feed in our emerger pattern through the eyelid through that piece of tippet. And we're going to add an additional 6 to 10 inches of tippet with the double surgeon's knot and finish it off with our bead-headed nymph with a non-slip loop knot. Now at this time, your emerger pattern should be able to float freely between the first double surgeon knot and the second double surgeon knot, hence why they call it a sliding dropper. As seen here, your heavy fly will want to go to the bottom, as your light second fly will move freely up and down the first tippet section, and your dry hopper or dry fly is going to be riding high above. This is a great way to cover 3 areas of the water column in one cast. Now, be careful casting this, as the more items you add to your line, the more likely you are of getting yourself into a huge tangle. Try not to false cast too much, but rather make your first cast as accurate as possible. The next rig setup is the Duncan loop dropper. We'll do the same setup as our free sliding dropper, but now we will position our second fly using the loop dropper. After you have your hopper set up and your dropper set up, we're going to be taking 6 to 8 inches of tippet, and we're going to attach it to our third fly. I'm using the improved clinch knot. And in between your hopper and your dropper, you're going to connect your third fly using a double surgeon's knot. Connect your free sliding dropper using another improved clinch knot. You can now move your fly up and down between your top and your bottom fly. This is great to use if you want to be more accurate of where your fly is going through the water column. Now both of these techniques can be used on hopper droppers and dry droppers. But just remember that sometimes adding more is actually hurting your presentation. So if you don't feel like you have control over your first cast or your rig, tone it back a little bit. You can be just as successful with one fly if it's the correct fly as you can with 3 flies that are not in season or the wrong flies. Now always check your seasonal hatch chart when heading out to the river. Now tie lines out there and get to the hopper!